Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 CCOVI Lecture Series. Today we are joined by Dr. Liette Vasseur, a full professor in the Department of Biological Sciences here at Brock University. She is a member of the Environmental Sustainability Research Center and a CCOVI Fellow. Since 2014, she holds the UNESCO Chair on Community Sustainability, from local to global. Her interdisciplinary research program links issues such as sustainable agriculture, climate change adaptation and resilience, community-based ecosystem management, and ecosystem governance. Her research is in Canada, China, Ecuador, and Africa. In Canada, major projects focus on sustainable agriculture and climate change adaptation in rural and coastal communities, and conservation in the Niagara Biosphere, a co-governed organization with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. She is the Deputy Chair of the Commission for Ecosystem Management at the International Union for Conservation in Nature and co-lead of the Climate Change and Biodiversity Policy and Practice Group, co-editor-in-chief of Botany at the Canadian Science Publishing, member of the Board of Directors of Nature Canada, and former President of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. Today, Dr. Vasseur will be presenting her research into cover crops, commercial, native, or exotic, or not at all. This remains a question. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. And I want to make sure I'm at the place. Okay, and so what I want to give you is a bit of a story of some of the research that we have done over the last few years, and giving you a bit that results sometimes can be quite controversial, more than we think. Okay, I guess I'll be doing that. So today I will first recap on cover crop and a review that we did that is now a revision related to what do we know about them. That's the first thing. Then I will go further in terms of two studies of my graduate students, one on insects and cover crop, and the other one looking at how can we use native species instead of the commercial species that are mostly introduced exotic. They are not from here. So when we look at cover crop, it has become more and more common to use it. It used to be not that common, and it was more like tillage and bare soil that many vineyards had for quite a long time. Interestingly, I work in China in tea plantation, and it's exactly the same thing that has happened, that started by bare soil, and now they're starting to think about cover crop the same way. The issues, however, when you don't cover the soil, as you know very well, is that we're talking about soil disturbance, degradation in the long term, and especially the reduce of soil health. And that's another issue when nutrients are getting leached because of runoff, and at that point it's not anymore available for the plants. There are also the issues of weeds, and several of these plants we believe are leading to pest dispersal and compete also with the grapevines, so especially for water and nutrient. So non-cash crop can be established as cover crop between or in rows, and they can provide services such as weed suppression, water management, and other components, especially increasing biodiversity. And this is something that is becoming more and more of interest, especially when we look at conservation issues. So there are several possible functions of cover crops, and it goes from reduced erosion, as I mentioned, the balance of water budgets and controlled vine vigors, increased biodiversity, the question of also nitrogen fixing, if you're using legumes, for example, weed suppression, the reduce of solar radiation on the ground. And I should say this is something that we tested in one of our vineyards. And just to give you an idea, the difference between places where we had the cover crops versus the place where it was bare ground, the difference in July, a few years ago, the difference in temperature was 14 degrees Celsius. So it makes a big difference. So really, the question of evapotranspiration, stress on the plants, become a lot higher at that point. There's a question of preventing leachate and volatilization of nutrients, biological control agent, depending on which species are used, that will change it also, and finally increasing the microbial activities and diversity in the soil. And that's important, especially when it becomes a kind of green manure that can be integrated. One thing that we are also looking at, and that's the big thing these days, carbon sequestration. Because this is really the big buzzword at the federal level right now. They know that if we can reintroduce this material in the ground, in the soil, it will help in terms of the soil quality because the release of nutrients, but also help the microbes and the fungi in the soil. But at the same time, that means that you can build the carbon. And when we talk about carbon sequestration, it's really to reduce the CO2 that we have in the atmosphere and bring it back in the soil. So this is what is kind of expecting. I have to say that I'm always a little bit laughing about that in some way, because when we talk about carbon sequestration, even if the government wants to have that very rapidly, usually it takes over 6, 7, even 10 years before you get real official carbon sequestration. So it's a kind of being optimistic. We have to do it because we need it, but we know that it will take a lot more time. So just to recap a little bit, why carbon sequestration is becoming so important, but also the importance of selection of cover crops is because of climate change. And I just have here a table that was published in 2015 on, and I'm hoping that we'll get new results. But I'll show you some results that we have from other places, but it shows that the biggest challenge that we'll have to deal with is the increase of temperature. We're in a region, the northern hemisphere, we are in a region where we know temperature, average temperature will be increasing. Precipitation, we have an increase of 20% that is expected in the Great Lakes Basin. We're talking more frequent extreme rain events. So that's another issue. We kind of tasted it last week. We have also the possibility of more prolonged drought in the summertime, as well as greater frequency of freezing rain. So that means less snow. So how is it going to impact our ecosystem? That becomes very important. Just to give you from the Climate Atlas Canada some of the newer data that we have. First of all, here you have the mean, I think that works at least. Yeah, so the mean annual temperature. You can see here that we went from the 70s at around 9.3 to right now getting towards the 11.4. We're around at 10, right now 10.2. And if you look at 2050, which is not that far from now, we're talking around 13.5 degrees Celsius. These are annual temperature, and it's important to understand the difference between the different seasons, okay? And that's something also important. So I put here, you can see summertime, we're talking moving from 20.8 to 25.2 by 2050, 2080. When we look at the winter temperature, this is probably something that is very important to connect, is that we're talking in the 70s that we had an average of minus 2.3 degrees Celsius to now getting closer to 0, especially this year. And if you look at 2050, plus 2.3 degrees Celsius. So thinking about adaptation of the plants, especially when we think about vineyards, how are they going to be adapting to these kind of conditions? And if you look at the number of days over 32 degrees Celsius, which is considered heat wave, at that point we're going from 5 days to 18 days, and this year, 2023, we have only 11 days, but it's still higher than it was before. And if we look at 2050, we're talking almost 40 days. So 40 days is over a month during the summertime where you have heat waves. So it's to keep in mind at this level. In terms of frost-free days, which is also very important, we're going from 198 to 218 and gradually to 244. So that's quite a big change in terms of the length of the season. That means that the last spring frost, for example, will go from April 16 to April 7 to gradually March. So in terms of the plants, that can become very complicated. It has an implication for what we will grow, and especially when we think about rootstock and varietals and all that, what can we grow that will survive in these kind of different new conditions over time. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. And this is the problem. When we talk about the last spring frost, we never know if we can have another extreme late frost later on. And that can also change a little bit the consequences of what's happening. So, but what do we really know in terms of cover cropping? And this is something that kind of cut into my heart quite a lot, because in the last couple, I would say 2 decades, people are becoming more and more interested in trying 2 different things. A lot of anecdotes, I should say, talking to grape growers, and I can understand, try some one thing, try another thing, and trying to see what can work and what cannot work. But we know that the vineyards are complex, and we have a lot of variation in terms of geographic location and climates. If you look at all the places where vineyards are located right now in the world. So much remains to be learned in terms of the role of cover crops, especially related to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. And not only the question of carbon sequestration here, but really looking more at the full picture. So we decided to do a systematic review of the literature that has been published until now related to cover crop. And we had 2 objectives. The first one is to review the current literature to assess the role of planting cover crops with the focus on climate change. That was the first part. The second part was also to assess the cover crop performance as compared to the resident vegetation. Because one thing that has become a big debate is that, do we know really if we really need cover crop, or if we should just leave the weeds? And that's a big question that remains unanswered, especially that many grape growers are going to use dandelion, chicory, a lot of these species that are considered not just weeds under comefra. So at one point it's like, okay, what do we do here? So what we did is we used the PRISMA protocol. So what happened is when you publish reviews, literature reviews, systematic reviews, or scoping reviews, many journals now are requiring that you use a specific protocol that you can very well explain the methodology. And in our case, we did search using the academic search complete. It is the Web of Science. Ideally, I would have liked to use Scopus, but we don't have it at Brock because we know from another work that we did with China that Scopus is probably the most inclusive and the most stable in terms of system search engine. So this is the flow chart of the review paper. I don't want you to read everything because it will be a little bit complicated. Just to say that after the acquisition of all the papers from the 3 sources, eliminating the duplicate, because sometimes they have the same paper in the 2 or 3 search engine, we finished by adding 2,360 papers. And from there, we removed the records that were not necessarily appropriate, that were not really focusing on what we did. Then moved other components like reviews and all this kind of things. So by the end, in terms of for the first objective, we had 121 papers, and for the second one, we had 42 papers, so for the performance review. So what can we say? Well, in terms of the, as I said, from the 2,360 papers, we went to 121 that were possible for us to use because they really were appropriate for what we were asking. What is interesting, 28 of these papers were done in only one growing season. And as you can see, most of them, it's not almost all, were in fact less than 3 years. And I should say most of them were only 2 years. So in terms of understanding the system, it's very short term, especially when we look at complex systems. Only 2 studies were done in Canada, so one in Nova Scotia, one in BC, and 40 in the United States, 10 in South Africa. And I should say in South Africa it was interesting because most of them were from the same vineyards. So it was kind of little piece, which happens sometimes. And the rest were all in the European Union. 47 had no information about climatic conditions. 28 were in experimental vineyards. 62 were in no management information at all. So they don't know what they were doing. And 33 were different vine varieties were used, and 18 different rootstock. What is interesting is in 36 articles, there was no mention of the varieties or the rootstock. So we don't know exactly what they were doing in terms of vineyards. More interesting point, 99 examined between rows, 16 in rows, 10 were doing both, and 6 papers were only doing resident vegetation. So resident vegetation, that means just the weeds that are growing and not more. 82 were examining only monoculture, 33 just mixture, and 21 were doing both. So it's kind of interesting, and we had some unknown, by the way, and all that. So I don't know how they were able to publish, but anyway, that's another issue. One major point is on the 121 papers that we examined, none of them mentioned climate change. So it means that even that is not really integrated into it yet. When we look at crop performance, it was interesting because on the 41 of the 121 that were assessed, they were able to compare the difference between the resident vegetation and the cover crop vegetation. Okay, so it's a very narrow number. On that, the number of species that were used, 23 genera for the monoculture, especially Trillium, Vicia, Avena, Lodium, and Medicago. In mixture, Festuca and Medicago were added a lot more. But you can see here in terms of legume, grass, and forest, there's kind of a different numbers. 63 species of legumes were used, 54 of grasses, and 23 for forests that were reported to be used in these experiments. And 31 papers had no information about the sowing rates and of what they did in the experiments. So we don't know what they put exactly. Now, when we look at the performance, what we wanted to know is, are these showing positive, negative, neutral results or variable results in their experiments? So what you have here is these positive, that means it has helped. Negative means it didn't help, in fact probably negatively didn't help. Neutral means there was no significant variation, and variable is that depending on the variable, they were changing or can be also between years and everything else. So we have invertebrates. For example, in the invertebrate, where you can see there was 1 positive, 0 negative, neutral was at 4, and the variable were at 8. What is interesting is when we look at community vegetation, you can see a lot of spread, but most of the time neutral. The same for soil. When we get to the microbe, it seems to be a little bit better. When we look at the vines, it's mostly neutral or variable. For the vine juice, in terms of, again, neutral. And the economics, relatively neutral. So it seems a lot of variation in the system. And what does it mean, really, in terms of, do we really need the cover crops or not? And how do we do that? So what we can see from this review is that we have a high diversity in experimental design, the reporting of the results, the interpretation, it becomes at that point very difficult. We cannot really see very, very well what's happening. So there's a lot of inconsistencies, if you want, in the experimental design, in the way to explain the information that is included or not included. It's most of the time not included in the experiments. So when we think about repeatability of experiments, it becomes at that point very, very difficult. And I should say this is a point that has been becoming very important in medical sector, in many other sectors. And this is something we probably need to start, even in this branch, to start thinking about how we present our results each time. Most, as you can see, were results that were neutral or variable. And very little difference, by the way, between residence vegetation and cover crop treatment. So it's to figure out the why. What is happening here? How is it working? So that was where do we go from there? So we know that more research is needed, but the research has to be local. It has to be adaptive to what we have, and also in terms of climate, but also the environmental conditions. We have different soil, we have different climate conditions, and we have to think about how does it work in our system. We have also to consider the need of the grape growers. If it's become too complicated, too expensive, and all that, it makes different barriers to adoption of different types of cover crop. It can also be that we have to start looking differently. And one thing that we are thinking in our case is looking at native species, and especially those that can be perennial. So that means that they can stay longer, or if they reseed themselves, that point, even if there's a bit some tillage, the manure is included in the ground, and at that point still can grow from year to year to year. So that's another component. The other component is to better understand how the insect community is interacting when you change vegetation. Because we know very well that some species of plants will attract more the parasitoids, and I'll show you a little bit some work that we did on that. But we know that some other species may probably attract the herbivores that you don't want because they will attack the grapes. So that's something we have to figure out, is the balance between which species are the best to bring the positive, not the negative. So I will present to my students' work. Alicia Gillian, she just defended last term, so there was on the committee. And in her case, she was working on a project that we have had for now over 4 years, 5 years, with 2 vineyards that are organic, because I'm part of the organic science cluster. And the one is, the 2 are completely different in terms of management. And one is no irrigation and one is drip irrigation. So that's something to be aware. And so what we did is we had first experiments in the greenhouse to figure out the species of cover crop that, in this case, they are commercial type, that were resistant and resilient, I should say, to either drought and or flooding, since we're past both extreme getting more and more frequent here. We need to figure out that one. So we did the greenhouse experiments, and from that we selected species that were tolerant to drought and flooding, that can keep a certain sustainability for the region in terms of our climate, high biomass yield on the ground, it's important, and ability to improve soil profile, and the capacity to have a couple of legumes to bring, as you can imagine, the fixing nitrogen component of it. So the species that we selected are the following. So we had the pearl millet. Interestingly enough, it worked very well in the greenhouse, when the film didn't work necessarily the best. What is interesting, talking to colleagues in Quebec, they love pearl millet. So it's kind of interesting, but they don't have the same soil, they don't have the same climate. So it shows the importance of very understanding at the local level what's happening. Crimson clover, heritage, ryegrass was one of our control, and the second control was a spontaneous vegetation. So we had plots of everything, and we had also plots of the mixture of the three cover crops. So we had the mixture, we had the residence, we had the commercial ryegrass, and we had each of them in monoculture. And the hypothesis that she wanted to test was especially the fact that if we increase cover crop mixture, we should also increase diversity, and especially with more, we hope, beneficial insects and neutral invertebrates rather than just the pests. So she had to identify her insect species that she collected, and from them be able to see which one were in the beneficial category, the neutral category, or the pest category. So it takes a bit some time. We still have, I should say, some insect to identify in the lab. So just to give you a bit some of our results, some of the results were expected. So that's at least something that we were knowing. So the first one was the variation among treatments and over time. Very few variation among treatments. And I'll explain in a few minutes why. But what we see, we had the three samplings, so June, August, and September. And what we can see in terms of richness, in the vineyard one, it was going down. And in terms of abundance, we had a peak in the summer, so in August, which is often expected, and then a decline after. But very few, very few significant results here. It's the same with the second vineyard. However, what is interesting in this case is the richness remains relatively similar. But however, we still have the peak in August in terms of abundance of species. Now, in terms of functional groups, so the pest, beneficial, and neutral, so you can see here, can be a collection over time. We can see that in terms of average richness, there's a bit some difference between the two, for example, the pest, but after that there's a decrease and a decline gradually. In terms of the vineyard 2, for example, in terms of beneficial, that was quite lower for most of the summer, and then up. And when we look at the neutral, it was quite mixed in terms of results. But there are variations between the two, most likely because of the type of management that is quite different between the two, which we were in some way expecting. And it's the same for the pest, higher in the vineyard 2, less beneficial, and in this case, relatively the same for neutral. So less beneficial, more pest is not a good thing, especially for organic vineyards. So that's something to keep in mind. For the sweetness, and I should say because we didn't have differences between the different treatments, we kind of pumped the data together. We felt that it was better at that point to give us a stronger idea of what's happening. And this is for pest and neutral in the sweetness. And you can see, again, relatively the same, except for again, the vineyard 2 that tend to have a little bit more pest than the vineyard 1. So So when we look at the beneficial in the sweet nuts, what we can see here is that the highest richness was in the spontaneous and the crimson clover in terms of beneficial. And, but it was not officially significant, you know, when we're talking about the 0.05, it was not at this level. When we look at, however, the vineyard 2, the crimson clover had the lowest, but it was only significant when we compared to the ryegrass. So these are showing a lot of variation between the different treatments, in part probably because of the variation in the field. And certainly for us, what we realize is the question of the success of the establishment of the seeds for these different crops. Some did a lot better than others. Hairy vetch, crimson clover, no problem. In fact, hairy vetch, I would be a little bit careful to put too much of it in vineyards, because it can get quite invasive. But it needs to be done more often at that point. It needs to be mowed. Now, I'll present you Kesha. So she's right now finishing her thesis in her case. And in her case, she wanted to look at the native species that we have in Ontario. Can we use them as cover crop? We already in some way use some of our invasive species as cover crop. How can we probably use our native species instead as cover crop so that they can probably help quite a lot in terms of the system itself, the biodiversity of native species, etc. What is also important, many of them, if not all, are perennial, and they can overwinter in our system, in our habitat. So that means that it can keep from one year to the next. And at that point, it will be more adapted to our local conditions, our environment. So that was the thing. And some of them are very attractive for parasitoids. So we're thinking more beneficial at that point. We were looking at that they are suitable in terms of going below the vine, drought tolerance, because they are more adapted to our climate, can establish well by seed, so they can overseed themselves if the plants are gradually getting too old, because perennial plants at one point don't survive. Nitrogen fixation and easily accessible. The easily accessible was a bit of an issue in our case. We now have better sources directly in Ontario, so that changed a little bit also our game plan, I would say, for the future. So the species that she has selected initially, so butterfly, weed, the purple prairie clover, the eastern purple coneflower, the wild licorice, the black-eyed Susan, the narrow-leaf blue-eyed grass, and the white leaf aster. The interesting part with the black-eyed Susan, the place where we got them, they said, oh no, they don't grow more than 30 centimeters. Yeah, right. Okay, be careful what some seed seller are telling you. It's not necessarily true, especially when I know that my garden, they are a lot bit taller than that anyway. So that's something we have to also be careful. So we know that this is probably another species actually that was scratched from our list. So we started with the greenhouse experiments. We like to start in the greenhouse just to see, first of all, potential of growth. How do they work? What is the possibility of mixture of these species, if they compete or not? And that was a big part of the analysis that we wanted to look at. So what we had is plants alone, so just one plant in the pot, monoculture with 6 individuals of the same species, and then the polyculture when we have the 6 species mixed together. 8 replicates per treatment, and we harvested after 3 months the plants. So you can see a little bit here in our greenhouse in the Karen's building. In terms of germination, you can see here that some are doing well, some are not necessarily, like the wild licorice didn't do as great. So that's to keep in mind, because if the success rate is low, is it possible that it takes more time or it does not establish when it's in the field, when it's in the very conditions? So that we have to keep in mind. Some others are doing very well, especially if we look at the white disaster, the high level, and the same even for Asclepiad and others. So that's one thing. One to note is the narrow blue-eye grass didn't germinate at all. And so we don't know if it's a bad batch of seed that we had, or it was just that the overwintering was not long enough, because they have to have the cold stratification, also of these seeds. So that's another issue that is unclear for us. When we look at the end of the experiment, at the harvest time, what you have here is the species in terms of their weight in monoculture. So in monoculture versus polyculture. So we have the mean and standard deviation. And here we have the p-value of the analysis between the two, the comparison, the t-test. And what you can see here, some were not changing too much, they were not significant. However, we can see here that for these three species, so the wild licorice, for example, when put in mixture, it didn't like it at all, okay? It's not very friendly for that. However, if you look at it for Rubicchia, so black-eyed Susan, it loves being with others. So that's the interesting part. And if you look at the aster, in this case, it doesn't like to be with others. So that's one thing that we know in terms of the dry weight of the shoots. When we look at the roots, we can see that relatively the same for that. But we can see here also with the other one here that we have a little bit of an increase as well in the root system. So there's a bit of competition there. So one way to better understand the level of competition of facilitation, because plants can either do competition between species, they can do what we call being neutral, so that means they don't care for their species, no interaction, or we can have what we call facilitation. So facilitation is when one species can help the other. Often it's through this root system in terms of exudates and the possibility of exchanging chemicals. In some cases, it may be just, and if you think about the three sisters in the indigenous world, where we have the squash, the bean, and the corn, one helps the other. So this is a system of facilitation. Okay. So you can have one or the other. So in this case here, as you can see, these three that we already talked about, we can see here negative, and I should say zero neutral, minus means competition, so they are affected by the competition, and positive means they are positively affected, so they are facilitated in their growth. And we can see here that, yeah, when we look, it's pretty much a black-eyed Susan that is a facilitator in terms of what's happening when it's in polyculture. So that means that if we were to use the aster and the licorice in mixture, we would have to be careful with which species they can grow. The one mixture that we had was probably not the most, the best system for them. They were not necessarily the happy campers. So we tried very briefly in the field. That was in 2022. Some of the spring started badly, as you remember, so it was a bit difficult to go and put the seeds and everything, and as soon as we put the seeds, we had the drought. So it was a bit complicated, and so seeds were planted in the vineyard 1, 550 seeds per plot. The plots were 1 meter by 1 meter, so you have them here, all there, so they were 80 plots. And we had 10 replicates, and because of the drought, we had to do supplemental irrigation at that point. We had no choice, if not, it was going to be impossible to have anything at all. Unfortunately, it didn't work that much, and the biggest challenge we got is that famous drought and extreme weed competition. Weeds are very good, they are more adapted to drought, and they were able to take over pretty quickly, as you can see here. And so we did 2 vegetation surveys, 1 insect collection. She's still analyzing that right now. But what we decided to do is reseed 5 of the species that we were more comfortable and to do the overwintering. So they were sown in November 2022 to be able to gradually go in 2023, so last summer, and look at the germination. As you can see here, especially Asclepia was getting a good shoot system now at this point. But it was still limited by competition and no-till. If you remember 2023, again, we had a very slow spring, which probably didn't help in terms of possibility of these species to grow. So we know that we still have a lot of work to do to understand that. But we have challenges because this is a vineyard with, that didn't do a lot of tilling. So the establishment of the cover crops are a little bit more complicated at that point. So these are the things that we have also to keep in mind. So in conclusion, cover crop, no real significant influence on richness, abundance of insect functional groups. Only trends for now, but that was one of our first studies on that part. Significant influence, however, due to management practices and the landscape complexity. And this is something that we're highly interested in because that's really what's happening in the landscape can highly influence what's happening in terms of the vineyards itself. Native species will require a lot more testing and research, and we highlight especially the complexity of working in operational vineyards, but it shows that this is the real life. We may want to have the best results in the greenhouse or in experimental plots, but when we get to the real life, it's completely different because the growers have their own way, their own management system, and this is something that we're not going to change necessarily. This is the thing, so we have to keep that in mind. So in terms of future direction in the lab right now, we're looking at first, when the climate change will persist, we have no choice, so we have to figure out the question of adaptation and mitigation. And when I talk about mitigation and adaptation, I put that as a gradient, because some action that we're putting are more mitigation, some may be both, and some may be more adaptation, depending on the type of system we're using. We have to study a lot more the individual cover crop performance in field setting, and especially to identify the direct relationship, what's happening, but also the possibility of biocontrol. We have the native species and methodology that we need to refine and see how we have to deal with that. And finally, as I said, and this is something that I'm highly interested in now, is the landscape ecosystem interaction approach and analysis, because former students of mine have been doing work on the perimeter planting, and that can have a big influence on what is going in as well. So that's something that we need to better understand, because if you have a big influence of the environment around you, you need to know what is coming in at that point and how it can probably influence all what's happening. So I just want to thank a lot of people because we needed a lot of people, and this is not everybody. I know that I'm missing a lot of names, but so this was under the Organic Cluster 3, chaired and served in the federal government. Thank you very much.
So you mentioned that you've kind of been interacting with great growers locally. What trends do you find in terms of cover crop selection and management that you're seeing in Niagara?
A lot of variation. Yeah. It goes from, now there are very, very few that are bare ground, a lot of ryegrass, but I've seen a lot of people now mixing with the oilseed radish, in some cases chicory, in some other cases clover. Had one even with strawberries. So it's a lot of variation. I think people are trying different things, trying to figure out, but it's to know what is working and what is not working.
And obviously, it's really dependent on the location.
Yeah. Because we have a lot of variation between, I would say, so from even the two places that we had was quite different.
So 2 million.
Yeah.
So do you need soil testing to be done before you recommend anything?
Yeah. We had the soil testing done in our case. We're still analyzing all that stuff. There's still a lot of data that we have to analyze. One thing that was interesting in one of the vineyards with one of the projects, we realized that the phosphorus level was way higher than the recommended dose. So that can influence not only the grape, but also the cover crops. So that's something also to be careful, is because this is the thing you want, and this is probably an advantage of the native species, is usually they're capable of adapting to the condition of our soil. But when you use commercial plants that are coming from another place and have been bred for, very specific conditions, they may probably be either depleted or may try to deplete from the grape the nutrient, and that's not going to help.
I know you were mentioning a lot of influences when you were looking at the cover crops, but is there any direction of looking at the pollinators, the bee populations, for example?
I know some grape growers are highly interested in that, and that's something is when you increase biodiversity, can you increase it in a way that it attracts the beneficial for the against the pest insect, but probably also having some other species that can be useful for having even a beehive or something. So that's something that that can probably change a little bit the way that things are done. So yeah, there's still a lot to know in terms of species.
Have you done any experiments to ever undermine cover crops, or is this all just down the middle of the road?
No, we did. In fact, I was with Kesha this morning because she's analyzing right now the in-row. And the in-row, we have a couple species that are promising. And now she's finishing some of the analysis and correlations, but just scoop, for example, with crimson clover under the vine, it seems to significantly reduce weeds. So that can be quite a beneficial component. There are trends in terms of also increasing beneficial, so predators, and reducing pests. So if that works, really, and these aren't preliminary results for that, but if it's really working that way, that may be quite promising.
Is there any others testing besides crimson?
Yeah, we had also Alicium. Alicium is a species that is being used in New Zealand. So we thought trying it here. The problem that we have, weather permitting, as we say here, that was the biggest challenge. Is we had our time to. The spring was so cold, so slow that the Alicium was not able to really grow enough before the weeds. So the weeds took over a lot on that point. But we expected, because it's known in New Zealand that they attract a lot of the parasitoids of the leafhopper. So that was the reason for that.
And how do they plants under the road? Because obviously there's some trees that might grow in there. It's like
Yeah, you have
to.
Yeah, you have to wait that the plant is removed, and then you have to seeds in between. And you try to do it before the weeds are coming in.
Yeah.
That's a big challenge.
And planting with water.
Yeah, exactly. So there are several factors. Knowing the water that we have and how much maybe a bit slow this year, for example. Yeah. say for the, it's now 4 years that we've been doing that, exactly none of the years were similar. Some have been hot spring with cold summer, some other have been wet spring with warm summer. We had pretty much everything. It has been different from year to year. And I think this is one thing that we have to think about. How do we adapt to that? Because I think you have to get used to that, get used to these variations from year to year. So how does it work?
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Please join us next Wednesday, February 7th, as Wendy McFadden-Smith will speak to her research and work on the spotted lanternfly, which can feed on more than 100 species of trees and plants, posing a significant threat to the grape tree fruit and other industries. Join us for Spot the Lanternfly next week. Thank you.